Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about my absolute favorite springtime fishing technique. This thing catches me so many bass every spring, no matter how cold the water is. We're going to break it down for you in today's video, so stay tuned. Let's get right into it. So since I live up here in the Northeast, every year we get our lakes frozen and do not get to fish for a couple months out of the year. Come springtime, when that ice melts, the water is super cold, like 40, 42 degree water temperature is what we start with fishing. And this technique has been deadly for me all the way from that time, all the way pretty much up until these fish are spawning. I've caught fish on this technique right here. I use it all spring. It's always rigged up the entire season. I catch a ton of fish on it, and it's so simple to use, so we're gonna break it down for you today. This is called the finesse swim bait. Pretty common technique. It's nothing groundbreaking, but if you rig it up properly and fish it correctly in the right areas, you will catch a ton of fish with it no matter how cold the water gets. And this is one that you'll be seeing me throw a lot here on the channel coming up soon, as our first trip is going to start in about 2 weeks here. We're finally starting to get some ice to melt. Weather's getting a little bit warmer. By the time you see this video, I've probably already picked up my new boat, so there'll be a boat tour coming soon, and then we're heading to Florida to do a little bit of fishing, and then coming back here to do some fishing as well. So now that we're going to have some on the water videos, if you want to see anything specific, go ahead and leave it in the comments down below. But today we're going to break down how to fish this bait. We're going to talk about the rod and reel setup you need, bait selection, jig head selection, everything you need to know there. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the actual retrieve on this, which unfortunately we're not going to be able to show you until some later videos in the future, but I'll explain it in today's video just so you get a general idea. So like I said, this is probably one of the easiest techniques to catch fish on, even in the winter when the fishing is super tough. Late winter, early spring, this thing is so easy to fish. Anybody can do it. If you've never been fishing before, if this is the first kind of lures you're trying to learn bass fishing, this is a technique you need to try. You will catch a ton of fish on it. And it's super simple. You don't even need a bait caster. You can throw this on a bait caster if you want to. I've done it. I use like a 6'6" to 7' medium action with 12-pound fluorocarbon, but I actually prefer a spinning rod for this because of how small the hook is, how light wire it is. I use just my drop shot rods. So this is my Kistler KLX 7' medium power fast action drop shot finesse worm rod. You don't need super fancy gear to do this either. Literally any 7' medium action spinning rod would work just fine. Along with any 7' medium action spinning rod you would have, your basic spinning reel will work too. So this is just a 2000 size Kistler Series 1 spinning reel, but literally any spinning reel in that 2,000 to 3,000 size range is what you're looking for. I like a smooth drag, especially because I fish for a lot of smallmouth with this. So that smoother drag allows these fish to make runs and not break me off. I'm fishing very light setup on this. Light hooks, light weights, light line. This is a very finesse technique. So I like a smooth drag, so if a fish wants to make a run, they're not going to break me off. And then your gear ratio really doesn't matter. This is a 6. I've fished with 5s. When it comes to retrieve, which we're going to talk about later, I'll explain why the gear ratio doesn't really matter on your spinning reel. And then I keep it super simple for my line setup on this reel as well. You can go straight fluorocarbon. There's 2 routes you can go with this, and if you want, you can use straight 8-pound test fluorocarbon would be what I would recommend using for that. But if you want to improve your swim bait fishing game with this technique, I highly recommend going to this lime green braid that I use here. Lime green, yellow, something high vis. I run 15-pound test braid, and I will tie an 8-pound fluorocarbon leader onto the end of that, anywhere between 6 to 12 feet, just so the fish can't see the braid and you get the invisibility factor of fluorocarbon. But the braid is going to be very important when it comes to your retrieve to make sure you're fishing this bait properly. You want to be able to see your line. Even though this floats and you're fishing a sinking bait, that jig head will get it down to the bottom, but the braid is going to tell you if you're keeping it down there on the bottom. And like I said, we're going to talk about that here shortly, but this was what I would highly recommend if you were just getting into this technique. Go with the lime green 15-pound, 10-pound, 20-pound braid, somewhere in that range, and put an 8-pound fluorocarbon leader on the end of it. And when it comes to actually rigging this bait up, it is even simpler than the rod setup. You're going to need a pack of swim baits, which I highly recommend going with the Keitech swim baits here. I fish a 3.3 most of the time, probably 95% of the time. If the bait is running a little bit bigger, I might go up to a 3.8, but more often than not, I just fish the 3.3, or I'll actually even downsize to the 2.8 Keitech if the fishing is tough. Typically in these winter, early spring months, the water's very cold, the bait is small, and the bass were more willing to eat a small bait in front of their face than some large bait swimming by. So I go to the smaller sizes. Specifically, the 3.3 is like my #1 choice. I pretty much only fish that size. And then when it comes to terminal tackle, you just need jig heads, and that's it. A jig head and a swim bait is all you need to make up this rig. And when it comes to jig heads, there's 2 routes you can go. You can either buy them and get these Gamakatsu round 26 jig heads. These are my favorite. They're a little pricey. They're like $1 a jig head. I think they're $5 a pack and you get 5 jig heads. But they come with a Gamakatsu hook. They're poured great and they are excellent. They have a 2/0 hook in there. That's the key to this. You want a very small hook, like a 1/0 or a 2/0 light wire hook. So I buy these round 26 jig heads. They have the right size hook in there for what I'm trying to do. Or you can pour your own. I have my own mold for these, and that's typically what I do. It's much cheaper to buy the hooks online and just pour them yourself. If this is something you can't do, then definitely buy the round 26 jig heads. But if you have the capability to pour your own, it'll save you a ton of money in the long run. I go through these things like water. I break them off all the time. It just happens. That's the way it is. But by pouring them myself, I save a bunch of money. And I've already even done a video on my channel on how to make these yourself. If you want to go back and check that out, I might leave it in the description below. And for the sizes of jig heads, I keep it really, really simple. 95% of the time, just like that 3.3, I'm going to be using a 1/4 ounce jig head. That's probably the most popular size that I use. If I'm fishing very, very shallow water with this, I can go down to a 1/8, or for suspended fish, if I don't want it to sink as fast, I make 1/8 size as well, and that's one that I'll keep. And then sometimes an in-between size, my mold doesn't have it, but I buy them in the round 26s, is a 3/16. A 1/8, a 3/16, and a 1/4 is pretty much what I throw most of the time. And then if I'm fishing some really deep water or heavy current, I'll go to a 3/8 ounce. That's about as big as I'll ever go. But like I said, I'm fishing this on a spinning rod. These lighter jig heads is what you want. You want a very light jig head and your bait to flow naturally down there on the bottom. You don't want it plummeting very fast. You just want it to slowly and gently glide across the bottom. That's why I go with these lighter jig heads. And lastly, color selection on these swim baits to get your setup ready to go. I use either a natural color, something that is very, very plain looking, like an AU and a Tennessee shad, electric shad, something like that. Some type of shad patterned bait. Or if the water has some stain to it, I'll just go to a white like the Sight Flash or the French Pearl. Those are the only 2 colors. If you wanted to keep this technique really simple, I'd go 1/8 and 1/4 ounce jig heads, and I would get white and electric shad. Those would be the only 2 colors that I would carry. Those are the ones I use 99% of the time, and it'll work just fine for you. So if you just want to get some basics to get into it, that would be what I would recommend. Now you got your swim bait all rigged up, ready to go. Where are you going to fish this thing, and how are you going to fish it? The first thing I'm going to do with this bait, I'm either going to look for bluff walls or points. Those are pretty much the only thing that I focus on in these cold water months. Those are the first places these fish will stage as soon as the water starts to warm up just a little bit, and that's where I'm going to focus my efforts with this swim bait. I'll parallel some bluff walls and reel it really slowly, either for suspended fish or ones down on the bottom, or I'll find a point they can stage up, particularly if it has some rock on it, that's even better, and I'll slow roll it right across that point. Those fish will get ganged up on the point, waiting to go somewhere, and if you can roll it through that school, you can catch a ton of fish. And when it comes to actually retrieving this bait, it is super simple, probably the easiest bait to fish out of my tackle box. You're literally going to cast this thing out there as far as you can, wherever you need it. The farther the cast, the better. You're typically fishing clear water with this bait. And then you're just going to start a very slow retrieve once this is on the bottom. And I mean reel it as slow as you can just to keep that tail kicking and maintain bottom contact. You want this bait within a foot of the bottom at all times. Just a slow, steady retrieve. You don't need to twitch your rod tip. You don't need to stop and start your reel. You just want a slow, steady retrieve and keep it within a foot of the bottom. If you're not feeling the bottom, this is why I like the braid. It helps you make sure that your bait is bumping into the bottom every once in a while. It doesn't need to be plowing through the bottom, but every once in a while you should feel it just tick a rock on the bottom and keep going. If you're not feeling that, your bait has probably left the bottom, because you're going to have a bow in your line going down to this bait, and you're going to be reeling from way up. This bait could be down in 20 foot of water. As you reel, it might start to pull that bait up off the bottom a little bit. If that happens, you're going to be fishing your bait over top of the fish, and you might miss out on some bites. So where the braid comes in handy is, first, if you can't feel the bottom. Secondly, you're going to, if you can't feel the bottom, kill your reel and watch your braid. And if it starts going back out, like it's sinking back down to the bottom, you want to let it go. Feed it some line and let it go back down to the bottom, and watch that lime green braid lay slack on the water again once it hits the bottom, and then start your retrieve again. Keep checking to make sure it's on the bottom. Maybe every 5-10 reels. If you don't feel the bottom anymore, just drop it back down there, and as long as you're keeping your bait down there, you're going to get a ton of bites with this technique. I hope you enjoyed today's video, learning all about my favorite technique for springtime bass fishing. I know this is nothing fancy, and this is probably one of the cheapest baits that you'll ever fish, but it catches so many bass, even though it's not a fancy, expensive bait. If you want to see this bait in action, go ahead and check this video out right here, where I've caught a bunch of smallmouth up on Lake Erie fishing this exact bait right here. And if you enjoyed today's video, hit that subscribe button down below so you don't miss any more of my fishing tips coming up.